To Midnight in America, your place for international affairs commentary on the internet. I'm live in Sydney, Australia, your host Salvatore Babones. It's midnight in America, 4 p.m. in Sydney. My guest is Jean Jonathan Bogais. Jonathan, what time is it in Paris, France?
Good afternoon. It is 6 o'clock in the morning in Paris, France, on what is a very cold day.
A very cold day in Paris, so luckily you're here with us in Sydney.
That's right, it's too cold in Paris.
But we are going to talk France, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about Emmanuel Macron. But before we get to Macron himself, I have to ask you about Boris Johnson's proposal. Boris Johnson, of course, is the, well, whatever they call him, the foreign minister of the United Kingdom. Do you know his title?
No, I don't know his title, but he's bigger than life. We know that.
Larger than life and the hair larger than Trump, I think is what you have to say about Boris Johnson. He proposed building a bridge across the English Channel, or perhaps you call it the French Channel. And any thoughts on Boris Johnson's bridge to France, or from the French perspective, perhaps the bridge to England?
Well, it's a very interesting commentary. When I heard about it, my heart pumped frantically. I'm a citizen of the world, but deep down I felt so French. And my ancestor, Napoleon, will be so happy to hear about this news. Just imagine today's United Kingdom. The British Navy, sadly, is in disarray. And that's what made the UK, the city and the Navy. There is a great city, but very little Navy. A bridge over the French Channel, let's call it a French Channel, will be the way to resolve 300 years of history. But let's not get there.
No, wait, but I have to ask because right now, as I understand it, if Napoleon IV wanted to invade England, he'd have to put his troops on the train because you can't actually cross by foot through the tunnel. So with the bridge, of course, you could march straight across and bring the tanks with you. Is that the theory? So why was he even talking about a bridge when there's already the tunnel? Do you have any idea?
No, I have no idea. I think it's one of the grand ideas of Boris Johnson, just to humor everybody. I mean, the tunnel is working very well. I've taken it so many times. But the bridge in itself, first, the mere cost. We cannot even quantify Brexit at the moment. How could we put a cost on a bridge between France and the UK? Would this address the migrant issues? I doubt very much. It seems to me that in the last couple of days, Prime Minister Theresa May decided that the British government would give $45 million to the French government in its attempt to control the migrant issues in Calais. So in that context, I failed to see how they could allocate money for a bridge that will allow more trucks coming to the UK and therefore more migrants.
So Calais is, of course, the French side of the Channel Tunnel, the French terminal of the Channel Tunnel. I thought they cleared out the so-called the jungle camp at Calais. Is there still a problem in Calais, or I thought that was all wiped clean at this point?
The problem has never been fully resolved. A year ago, yes, the French government decided to build new centers all around France to relocate the migrants from Calais.
Right.
The reality, though, is that the migrants entering France do not want to stay in France. The majority don't. Many of them has, English as a first or second language, and they want to go to the UK. So it doesn't matter what the French government does. There's still groups of people, as we see at the moment, merging towards Calais. And this has become a very sensitive issue. French President Macron was actually in Calais only days ago in delivering his speech on the new immigration policy and trying to take, on the one hand, a very tough stand against, migration so that he could satisfy the domestic audience.
Right.
But at the same time, trying to convince the British that the French were very generous and they wanted a greater partnership with the UK. So it's very ambiguous.
But Macron is, you said, is taking, or at least publicly taking, a tough stance against migration. But as I understood it, the liberal European project that he endorses so strongly is one of a multicultural Europe that embraces, the recent refugee flows from Syria and embraces the globalization of Europe. Or am I hearing two different things in two different ears, or am I just not understanding the situation?
I think you are getting two different stories. On the one hand, multilateralism, and on the other hand, bilateralism. When President Macron was in China just recently and introduced a notion of make the world be great as an answer to Donald Trump's, make America great.
Yeah, I love
his
that.
Emphasis,
pledging to make the world great again.
That's correct. That's correct. And of course, President Xi embraced that notion because of multilateralism. However, what is currently happening in Europe is very different. Macron would like multilateralism, but to achieve this, he's looking at developing agreements on a bilateral basis. It is impossible in the current context to have multilateralism in Europe. I mean, Europe is bordering on dysfunctionality. The re-emergence of nationalism in the old Eastern Europe, and also the fact that we do not have yet a functioning government in Germany. We got Brexit with the UK, Greek issue, Spanish with Catalonia. The list is endless. So at the moment, we are looking very much to a return of all the agreements and the alliances that were made just before, or the decade before World War II. And that was based on bilateralism, multiple alliances, multiple agreements. But it is impossible at the moment to use the term multilateralism for Europe.
So you're really imagining, well, imagining is maybe the wrong word, observing bilateral agreements or limited multilateral agreements within the European Union as being a kind of return to, well, we won't call them great powers anymore, but a return to European power politics in some sense. Am I
very
right?
Indeed,
Without
that's
the
the
tanks
case.
and without the troops, I mean, nobody's talking about invasions, I assume.
No, but everybody is talking about reinforcing borders and also reinforcing security. So we are not talking about military alliances like we did before World War I and, of course, World War II, but we are also looking at an increase in security from a slightly different perspective. In France, one of the second decision that President Macron took was actually to look at the legislation on terrorism, anti-terrorism. What he did was to transfer the condition of the state of emergency following the attack in Paris and other places in France, and include what was supposed to be conditioned for a limited time into common law. So those very extreme conditions, military in the street, the right to keep people in custody for up to 5 days, and so on, are now part of common law. So when I describe this security paradigm, the security environment that we had prior to the Second World War, we actually now looking at an increase in security, and this is matched by also an increase in protectionism and a rise in nationalism.
Well, I'm interested to hear you say that because I was looking earlier today at a photo of Emmanuel Macron meeting Xi Jinping, I think it was a week ago in Beijing. And of course, Macron is famous for the handshake, as is Trump. And he was grabbing Xi Jinping with two hands, grabbing him, one hand in the shake, one hand on the arm, almost wrestling Xi Jinping. Of course, Xi Jinping being Xi Jinping was just standing there with his hand, no expression on his face, shaking the hand. But that image in my mind gave me the idea of, in a way, the anti-Trump, in a sense that, Emmanuel Macron is in many ways like Trump, but the opposite. He's not completely unlike Trump. I mean, Angela Merkel is completely unlike Trump. They have nothing in common. But it sounds from what you're saying that Emmanuel Macron may have the opposite politics from Trump, but in some ways be a mirror image figure, if you know what I'm saying.
Absolutely. But one thing that we must keep in mind with Emmanuel Macron, Macron loves theater. He loves dramatic presentation.
Well,
so he's very
Trump.
visual. Indeed, but I think in the case of Macron, he's looking at what France used to be before the French Revolution. That seniority within a monarchy.
Before the French Revolution.
Yes, indeed. And he's been compared to Louis XIV a number of times.
Really?
And that's really important because during that same era, we had probably one of the best political and military strategists France had never had. His name was Cardinal Richelieu. And Richelieu was actually the strategist. He was a priest, he was a cardinal. Right. But he was actually involved in politics to a grand scale, European politics, of course. And he defined what was called a raison d'etat, which later became real politics. And what Macron likes to do is to rethink the notion of real politics. Now, for example, when he became elected, I was in Paris at the time at the Louvre, and we saw him walking. Everything was orchestrated very much as a monarch would do. And since his election, it had become a trademark of Macron to show his politics through his body language. This is what he did, of course, with Trump.
Right.
That's what he did with President Xi. And it's a constant repeat. So now we could profile him and just through his body language, define exactly the message that he wants to pass.
Yeah, it's funny. As an American, I can't help pointing out that as an American, or maybe even English people have the same reaction. When I hear Cardinal Richelieu, my first reaction is Monty Python. And of course, I forget that Cardinal Richelieu in French history is, of course, one of the major figures of French political history. Would you really think of... Does Macron himself recognize this connection? Does he think of himself as a neo-Richelieuian, forgive my, to coin a term, a neo-Richelieuian figure, a real politic figure? Or is... Because he presents himself in the English-speaking world as much more of an idealist, not a realpolitik nationalist.
Well, that's a very important question because Macron is first and foremost a technocrat. In fact, we could create a new term to define him, and that could be an auto-technocrat. And I think that would qualify really well. Ideology...
It sounds like Kevin Rudd.
Yes. I don't think there is a great deal of ideology involved. He is extremely pragmatic, and we'll look at causes and effect. But the thing with Macron, he has a large number of advisors coming from the most, the most profound intellectual movement in France, universities and so on. Just looking at his government and the people he traveled with, we found, la crème de la crème of the intellectual movement in France. And he selected them very carefully. So that allows him to play a role in France at the moment, but also trying to portray this overseas. In France, because he was elected with less than 20% of the population's vote.
Though to be fair, anyone who was elected, we would still be saying they were elected with less than a quarter of the population's vote because of the way the system works in France.
That's right. In this case, it was even much less. So many people didn't vote. And so Macron's argument is, I have been elected, I can do what I want, and he does. Very little consultation.
Right.
Is very authoritarian. in his approach to politics. That's very important in France.
But to be fair, I mean, I've heard a lot of criticism of Macron at the time of the presidential election. But if I remember right, his new party swept the parliamentary elections as well. Is that correct?
That's correct. One of the great qualities of Macron is to introduce instability within a political system. If we look at the history, his first political appointment was under François Hollande, the former French president, and he was Minister for Finance at the time. Never France had a minister in a government who also started a social and political movement. So putting pressure on the president and the government in trying to, enforce new ideas, and in some ways, not blackmail, but, say, look, if you don't do what I want you to do, I will just go on my own. Eventually, that's what he did. And he did exactly the same with all the political parties. What he has done is to demolish the left, literally, socialism. To this day, is non-existent in France. It imploded. But he also strategized to do the same to the right path of politics, which is very traditional in France. So he's a great strategist. And his support at the moment, which is starting to fade away because it appears that, of course, many people realize that, he has an agenda. And that's not necessarily a social agenda to the benefit of the less privileged classes. And that's what we are facing.
Right. I have to ask you, though, about the role of France in Europe, because the way you described Macron is so different from the Trump administration, right? An administration of experts, of top experts in every field. Does that, in combination with the disarray of the European Union, the disarray in German politics right now, Germany's been without a government for months, has a government, but without a majority government, for months. Does that technocratic core of Macron's administration give France a much more of a leadership position within Europe, or not? I mean, I don't follow the issues closely enough to understand it. Could you help me and anyone listening understand that a little better?
Yes, it is an illusion. Macron is a very fine strategist. He is an opportunist. He is very pragmatic. He obviously has identified a great weakness in Europe at the moment. Now, when he was elected, part of his campaign, unlike the Extreme Right in France or other parties, was actually to reform Europe. He embarked into his election with a project to reform the institution and especially to reform the Eurozone. Right. Now, he obviously could see an advantage at developing a greater relationship with Germany. That has not been very well seen in France because he allowed a number of takeovers of very important French corporate companies by the German counterpart, something that was not very popular. But so he wants to consolidate the relationship between Germany and France. Many in Germany, especially within the SPD, do not want this because they look at France in a very vulnerable economic position in comparison to Germany, which it is. Right. Looking at the currency, for example. So this relationship that Macron wants to develop or wanted to develop with Angela Merkel is at the moment coming back to haunt him because it's not happening. Right. So what he wants to do is to try to create an opportunity for France to be more present in Europe. Right. Now, that in itself is very much of an illusion because the reality is that he has to be able to deliver what he says, and we don't think that's going to happen.
Right. Now, I know Macron has proposed a Eurozone finance ministry that would have a Eurozone, consolidated Eurozone budget. But that would presumably lead to, I mean, if there were actually fiscal transfers on a unified scale across Europe of the kind that we have in the United States, that would involve much higher taxes on French citizens to pay for this Eurozone budget. Have people really thought through that, on the one hand, there's this national pride desire to be a leader in the Eurozone, but on the other hand, leadership is expensive. Is there much appetite among the French electorate for a leadership role in the Eurozone?
None whatsoever. In fact, Thomas Piketty wrote about it recently.
Right.
Now there's absolutely no desire in France for this new situation. And there's no desire in Europe either. So that's, part of Macron's vision.
Right.
But that's not going to happen.
So why does he have the vision if it's not politically? I mean, is he not a politician first and foremost? Why have a vision that's not politically palatable?
I think Macron is very ambitious, but in some ways is also delusionary. Macron, if we look at the psychosocial element of Macron has never experienced failure. He's a young politician, extremely successful. He was a merchant banker. He came from a solid, not wealthy, but very solid family. Macron has never experienced failure, never experienced hardship. So to him, the notion that you could build and fail is totally foreign. So his opinion of himself is of a real leader, seeking perfection. Now we know that perfection doesn't exist.
Well, let me ask, I think some people, if I use the Kevin Rudd analogy instead of the Donald Trump analogy, I think some Australians might have felt that Kevin Rudd was not so much running to be Prime Minister of Australia as running to be Secretary General of the United Nations, which is the job he really wanted. In the same way, it sometimes sounds like what Emmanuel Macron wants is not to be President of France, but to be President of the European Commission. Is there any sense in which that's the job he's running for?
It's a very fine observation, Salvatore.
Merci.
And I totally agree with you. Everything has been too easy for Macron. I mean, he's very young. He's president of France.
How old is he? Do you know?
It's a very good question. He's like in his mid-30s. Sorry, I have a memory blank.
He's younger than 40.
Yes, indeed.
Oh, I didn't realize.
Indeed. Yes. It's hard to imagine him after Macron as a president. I do not believe that he will be re-elected. I think there will be a shift in France in the forthcoming years that may lead to that. And the worst case or best case scenario, depending where we are coming from, he may have another term. But nonetheless, he will still be very young before he exits politics.
And are there term limits?
I think politics is only a transitional phase for Macron, part of his development.
Are there term limits in France?
Yes, 5 years.
Okay, so he can't do like Putin and be president for 2 terms, then prime minister for 2 terms, then president for 2 terms again?
This is not going to happen. He could do 2 terms, and that will be it.
That's it. Okay.
And France's story it's never happened before. Years back, it was 7 years. It's been cut down to 5.
Okay.
But very rarely would we. I mean, I wouldn't even conceive the possibility for a president to do more than 2 terms.
Oh, okay. Let me put up the call-in lines. If anyone listening would like to call us and ask a question of Jean Jonathan Bogais, my guest today, here are the numbers. It's Skype, Babones, or if you're in the U.S., you can actually call in on a U.S. phone number, 412-567-6798. Or if you happen to be in Australia, the Australia number is 02-8003-6853. But probably the best thing for my American listeners out there, 412-567-6798. I'll leave that up for one more second. I can't guarantee the technology. We really hope that Skype will work. It has been tested to work, but then Skype is now owned by Microsoft and has been for many years. So we can't really make any promises about that. But if you're out there and you'd like to call and Skype will cooperate, we'd love to hear from you. So I'll just let that go. Anyone listening will have caught that. Well, let me put it up. I'll ask you one more question. What do you think about France's role in the world? If we get outside of Europe and think about this China connection, does France have an independent foreign policy with regard to China, or is it really just a European Union foreign policy with regard to China, and European leaders visit, take pictures, but have little to talk about?
I think France's foreign policy at the moment is trade motivated. So, in a similar fashion as that of the US, the French are selling arms in a grand scale all around the world. What we've seen in China, for example, is a series of trade agreements, some military, some civilian with Airbus, large number of planes, and so on. So the foreign policy is very much based on trade. There is no real ideology to bring or to reintroduce the notion of France as a diplomatic statue. Macron is trying to do this, but I think there's a long way to go, and France will have to be probably stronger than it is now. As I said before, Macron is not a populist as what we've seen, with President Trump, Duterte, and others. So he has a window of opportunity, and France, through him, has a window of opportunity. But that window will eventually close, and I do not think, as much as I would like to, I do not think that it is going to impact.
Right. As an American, it's something I often wonder. European Union is, an economy of a similar size to the United States or North America. Yet in Asia, my impression is that European countries or the European Union as a whole effectively have no Asian policy as such. I mean, I know in the former colonies in Africa, of course, there's a lot of involvement of especially French troops all across northern and Central Africa, but not really in Asia. I mean, is there any foreign affairs angle that Europe or France have in Asia? Are they involved in, Vietnam is a former French colony, Cambodia? Is there residual involvement in French foreign policy in Asia?
No, very little. In fact, there's been even greater opposition, especially in Southeast Asia, against Europe and France specifically, mostly because of human rights issues. Most Southeast Asian countries are shifting or have shifted to semi-authoritarian or military rules. And the European Union, looking, at Cambodia, Myanmar, and other spaces, have tried to push, the human rights issues,
right?
And without realizing that the time where they could have done it years ago do no longer exist, right. And therefore there is a process of adaptation to current situation in Asia that Europe has not been able to achieve. Right. So once again, trade dictates the policy, but there is no inherent, solid European Union or even French policy in Asia at the moment.
Right. So when people want to put pressure on China over its human rights record or over religious freedom in Tibet, that's the European Union is not a serious factor in those discussions. I mean, let alone France. Is that fair to say?
It is very selective. European Union and France has put a tremendous amount of pressure on Cambodia and, of course, on Myanmar recently, right, because of the problem with the Muslim communities and the Rohingya people. And yet, when President Macron was in China, he said that he was not there to interfere in China's affair and will not discuss human rights issues. So, it's very selective. Once again, trade dictates the foreign policy.
So I find, so did he actually say that out loud, or is that simply something you infer from his?
No, he said while he was in China that he would not, because he was asked to deliver messages to the Chinese government, and he said that he was not going to interfere. His role was not to interfere in a foreign country's affairs, and thus he would not talk about human rights.
Well, I find that quite ironic and almost funny, because of course Donald Trump visited China last year, and on Trump's visit to China, he focused heavily on trade. He was heavily criticized for not making human rights more of an issue in China. And I don't know what Macron had to say about that, but the sort of people who admire Emmanuel Macron were condemning Donald Trump for not being tough on human rights when he visited Asian countries. Does Macron get criticized for that in France? I mean, is this... I mean, are people critical of that stance, or do most people simply embrace it?
I think some embrace it because they believe that they need Macron. Many don't. It's actually very divisive. You know, what Macron has achieved is to increase the degree of division in France. Now, that is a concern because we are looking at only 6 months as a leader, as a president. Now, he still have over 4.5 years to go. Right. And that is a great concern in many ways for many French people.
Yeah, I mean, the sovereigntist aspect of it, what's funny is it's so reminiscent of the official line out of China and out of Putin's Russia, that internal sovereignty is absolute and other states should not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. In Russia's case, it's ironic, given the Russian interference in the US election. But in China's case, it's real. I mean, China, for all the talk here in Australia about China interfering in internal politics, I think there's no evidence of China interfering in US politics. And I think precious little of China actually interfering in Australian politics. I mean, China is very aggressive about this message of non-interference in other politics. It's amazing to me to hear that a major European leader, and especially one so closely identified with the liberal internationalist agenda, that someone like that has accepted that Chinese narrative. So I just want to make sure we're on the same page. That was clearly the message he was sending, that I'm not here to interfere in internal politics, I'm here to represent a country to country.
That's correct. And he used the term human rights. He was not, that was during the press conference. He said that he was not going to discuss the issue of human rights. Of course, also political leaders in France jumped at this opportunity. But fundamentally, you know, that's what happened. Whilst only weeks before, Macron and most members of the government and also the opposition strongly criticized the leader by default, you know, Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar for not taking action against the plight of the Rohingya. So we have a contradiction there, which is absolutely flagrant. And that reinforced my view, which I expressed early, that Macron is fundamentally pragmatic. I do not think there is an ideology worthwhile following. He is, you know, as I said earlier, an auto-technocrat. And that fits the bills really well.
Unfortunately, we're just about to wrap up the show. So I just want to ask you before we close, you know, do you have any thoughts on the future of the Macron government? As you said, you know, we're 6 months into a 5-year term. It may be a 10-year term. Any final thoughts you have that you'd like to share with people watching the video about the future of Macron in France and in Europe?
I think the future of his government, Macron's government in France, will certainly be challenged in times to come, mostly on economic and social grounds, because he is implementing or trying to implement some very difficult reforms that will affect many people in France. So the gap between wealth and poverty is going to increase. There's no doubt about this. So we are going to see a trend toward, you know, demonstration, dissatisfaction that may lead to him not being re-elected. In Europe, I think he wants to portray the image of the leader, but yet in a time where nothing much is happening in Europe at the moment. From a European perspective, putting Brexit aside. So he can, you know, take a pseudo-leadership position. But the question is, how can he deliver on this? Because there's actually no real policy. We have been talking about, you know, the changes to the Eurozone, perhaps. But there's nothing else.
Well, thank you, Jean Jonathan Bogais. We'll have to leave it at that. Thank you for being on the program.
Thank you, Salvatore.
My pleasure. Next week, we will have Eric C. Hendricks talking about regime theory in China. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we hope you've enjoyed the show.